by someone who worked for Jaguar for over 20 years, training up dealerships on how to sell you guys cars. And I think he did quite a good job by the looks of things. Welcome, Peter Leake, everyone.
Thank you very much. Glad to see my fan clubs here.
Peter, you had a fantastic career within Jaguar. Where did it begin for you? How did you get to work with that famous brand?
Okay, well, I'm looking around nervously at the audience at the moment in case there's anybody there who wants to correct me on this. But I started in the days of BL. If you remember British Leyland, anybody old enough to remember those people, Allegros and stuff like that. I was an Austin apprentice at Longbridge for 3 years and then moved on to Fleet with what was JRT. And then that was working with Jaguar. And then right from the early 70s or mid-70s, working at Browns Lane one day a week at Land Rover, and then 3 days at this nut house in Redditch, which was their sales and marketing HQ. I went out on the road as a sales exec with British Leyland as it was. And then in '82, when the split between Jaguar and Leyland and the whole Leyland breakup started to happen under the John Egan period, it was just starting to happen, I moved over as their first trainer in 1982. So spent 30 years at Jaguar itself, 38 in total.
There must have been a great mindset change needed in Jaguar at that time, because basically they'd gone from having Jaguars that was a part of the catalogue lineup, basically, of all the other British Leyland marques, to now being a marque on their own.
Yes.
What were the challenges in sorting the brand out and re-communicating it then?
Well, I think re-communicating is the word, Wayne, to be honest here, because you were part of British Leyland. And there's a whole host of stories, like the XJS, they were wanting to put the V8 Leyland engine into that, but Bob Knight made sure that didn't happen. But also there was a whole mindset with the dealers, because suddenly you had 350 Jaguar dealers which were part of British Leyland, which clearly wasn't going to work and it needed to be looked at. So the John Egan era, which started in 1980, and John will obviously explain all that, was an exciting time because that's when we re-established ourselves as a brand.
Incredibly important part of running a car company, isn't it? Because it's the customer's first contact point with the manufacturer. And we all know we've had dealers that we've gone in and asked about cars, and perhaps we've come away thinking, oh, I didn't really like the way I was treated there. It's so important. It can make or break a sale.
Oh, God, it can. It is interesting because people like me as a sales trainer are always going to have a job on the basis that you can lead a horse to water, you can't make it drink. And so often, there was a, dare I say, quite a sexist attitude at times within selling cars. It was the man's car. Yes, I did say the wrong thing there.
That's how that goes down now.
Yeah, that went down like a lead brick. Good. But obviously we needed help to change that mindset, because that just was not right. And that was a long process. But a process that was done, I think, started really internally with John and the team, with the hearts and minds, because you can't go around telling other people what to do until you get your own house in order. So that whole breakaway from Leyland needed to be thought through, and not least of which was investment as well. That was another big story, but again, that's one that John will no doubt talk about.
Well, get it in order you did, because as the 80s ended and the 90s began, the X300 XJ6 sold in vast numbers, and that really turned the fortunes around for Jaguar under Ford, didn't it, that car?
Yes, I think it did. I think it is fair. The comment you made really quite early on about John saving Jaguar, he did, because there wouldn't have been a company there for Ford to have bought had it not have been saved in the first place. But of course, by the beginning of the 90s, there was yet another mini recession, just at the time as Ford bought us, as you know, in the end of 89, beginning of 90. And really, Jaguar was under the microscope. It was a case of, well, we've bought this, what are we going to do? How are we going to make it work? An X300, if you will, was the very first car to come out. Not a totally new car, as we know. It was built upon the XJ40 substructure and running gear and so forth, but it was a major step forward. The big car was XK8, and that was the one where the massive change came in.
It was a real iconic moment for Jaguar in the 90s, because it kind of felt like at last there might be a successor true to the E-Type. But was there a sense of nervousness at the time amongst the workforce of being taken over by Ford? How was that taken internally?
Well, I think it's interesting because during the 80s, the workforce and all of us are regarded as workforce, all got together. We were all on the same page. We recognised that if we didn't make Jaguar work, we weren't going to be here the following day. It was as simple as that. I think when Ford came along, there was a lot of nervousness. There's no doubt about that, because whenever anybody's taken over, you know, people lose jobs and that sort of thing. But Jaguar was prepared for the challenge, and there was a particular director from Ford by the name of Jim Padilla, and he was a great guide for us. He helped guide us forward through this Ford process system, because Ford was into processes. We were possibly not quite as far advanced with processes as we may have been. But Jim Padilla, whatever he threw at us, one of his comments was, whatever you throw at the Jaguar workforce, they always come back and they do one better. They're always on the case. And that was a great, great praise indeed from a guy who took no prisoners, and we'd be quite honest with that.
I remember the excitement around the XK8 when it was launched, and I remember going along to one of the launches at one of the dealerships. It was in Peterborough, it was at Marshall's.
Marshall's, yeah.
Graham Searle from the Jaguar Enthusiast Club was there, and it was a bit of a partnership actually, wasn't it, between the JEC and Jaguar to do a kind of tour of regions around those dealerships. I'm not ashamed to say I blagged my way in and gate crashed with my dad. I was only young at the time, but it was a point at which I remember Jaguar becoming exciting again. Yes. Was that your feeling as well at the time?
Yes. I think it was. I think the excitement really got started in the 80s, and it really was kicked off by the winning of the European Touring Car Championship in 1984 with Tom Walkinshaw with the XJSs, and it was an extraordinary feeling. We thought, yes, we can do this. We are good enough. We are the best. And then, of course, the Le Mans victories in 88 and 90 suddenly propelled us forward, but possibly propelled us beyond where we actually were at, if that makes sense. So in the eyes of the world, Jaguar was back. But again, we still, behind the scenes, had a lot to do in terms of quality, processes, and getting it right. And the XK8, when it was launched in '96, really was where we were under the microscope to really deliver. And it was the job one day to the 1st of June, which had to be met. And job one is the first car that's saleable, so that's the one that really matters. And we made the job one date, and that was party time. Now, to outside the company, that means nothing, but internally, it was everybody was having a party, jumping up and down and screaming and doing all sorts, as we did regularly at Jaguar. So it was magic. It was a magical moment.
The XK8 changed Jaguar because it was not an out-and-out sports car, but it had a sports DNA, and it had felt at that time like a long time since that had been in the company. The XJS had got sort of bigger throughout the 90s, you know, and was there that feeling that perhaps sporting marks had come back into Jaguar?
I think we dared to dream. I think you're right. And I think by 98, when the XKR came out, then that was absolutely what you're saying, Wayne, is spot on. I think we had a dilemma at the outset because you had E-Type in 61 that came out. The only wood a customer could see was the steering wheel. Okay, so it was not a wooden leathery type car, although the seats were leather, obviously. But then you came through that sporting era. But the sports car market around the world was changing, particularly in the United States, where we'd had the Pinto affair, where it looked as though sports cars, particularly convertibles, were on their way out. So we bought in the XJS, which was more of a Grand Tourer. And if you looked at that car, people say, well, that was never an E-Type replacement. Well, no, it wasn't. It was a completely different motor car. And I have to say, the first Jaguar I ever drove when I joined the company I worked up in Manchester, and it was an XJS. If anybody here has had one of the very early XJSs, quite an extraordinary car. Those were the days when you'd have a friend of yours would have the same car, and you'd be maybe having a coffee in the canteen, and you'd say to him, listen, I did well with my XJS. I got 18 miles to a gallon. And he'd smile at you and laugh and say, well, I beat you, I got 12. It was a whole different attitude towards things like fuel consumption and economies. But the XJS set new standards in performance, refinement, and so forth. So a dilemma comes when XJS, our most successful sports car to date at the time, 21 years, it's a long time. When the XK8 came along, it was, well, what are we? Are we going back to full sports? Are we going to be GT? And initially, it was more the GT. But as we all tested the cars internally, there was a feeling that we needed to do a sports pack. And if you notice, when we launched the car in '96, we launched it with a sports pack. Not an engine variant, but in terms of trim and so forth. So yes, that feeling was coming back.
And there are knockers in the motoring press of the XJS. Yeah. Well, to those uneducated, silly people who knock the XJS, I say it was good enough to not only be in production for 21 odd years, but it also lent the underpinnings to the XK8.
Yes, absolutely right. I mean, the XJS was known by many as the ugly duckling, which I disagree, because I thought the car was a superb piece of kit. And when, of course, the convertible finally came along, that gave us a wider diversity. But also, with the V12, you were rather restricted in what you could do. So in '83, we launched it with the 3.6 variant engines, the AJ engines, and that opened up a whole new market for us, particularly bringing back manual gearboxes, which we hadn't seen since early XJSs. After that, it was private conversions or whatever. So yes, it all started to come together.
Well, I think a true test of whether a car is a success is if quarter of a century later it then gets classified a classic, and we can certainly say that the XK8 is now a classic, a modern classic, but a classic nonetheless, a mark of its success for sure. But as we go into the 2000s, we get another milestone, because in 2001, the Ford influence really comes to the fore here, and suddenly Jaguar are making a compact saloon. The X-Type arrives.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's an interesting one, because obviously when Ford bought us, we were a two-car model lineup. We were XJ and XJS at the time. We'd successfully introduced X300, so we'd done that successfully. The XK8 now was successful, so we still had a mainstream of two cars. At the end of the 90s, though, we then moved into our third range, which was the introduction of the S-Type. That then started to change the whole outlook again. We were going back almost to the 60s, where we had quite a lineup of products before we rationalized towards the end of the 60s. But then you started to see S-Type come in, and you also started to see a bit of a dilemma between, do you introduce a radically new car, or do you bat safe and go for sort of a previous Jaguar S-Type Mark II style? In other words, it was a dilemma. Do you do one or do you do the other? We went with the other, and we tended to go with that redesign, if you will, of the S-Type, that reimagination. By X-Type, Ford clearly wanted to see payback from that investment, which if you were investing, you would expect payback as well. X-Type came along. Okay, we understood that the underpinnings were from Ford, because sharing platforms is not unusual. If you say to an Audi A4 owner that he's driving a Passat, I'm sure he wouldn't be too happy about that. But for some reason with Jaguar, we got a little bit lambasted. But the X-Type, you ask owners of X-Types, they love those cars. And as cars internally, they were literally bulletproof. They were super.
It's a true British trait, isn't it? When we talk about our motor industry, there's any opportunity to put it down, and often people try and put the X-Type down by saying it's a Mondeo in a dress, but by saying it's the world's biggest selling car underneath and the most popular car probably ever built by Ford, it's not really that much of an insult, is it really?
Not really. It's putting it in perspective, because I used to do the motor shows for Jaguar, and I've done them from 74 all the way to 2012. And it was interesting when you had people come on the stand and go, it's a Mondeo, isn't it? The first question you found yourself asking was, what makes you say that? And there would be silence. Okay, so again, it's almost a media thing that comes through, and then it gave you an opportunity to explain what Jaguar had done to the car, because don't forget, when the X-Type first came out, it was an all-wheel drive car, and people forget that it wasn't front-wheel or rear-wheel drive; it was an all-wheel drive V6 engine, 2.5 or 3-litre V6. It was a quantum leap from that perspective, and that's in that particular sector.
For us, as a club point of view, 20 years on, as we sit here in 2021, they are an incredibly important car, the X-Type, because they are the route in, the affordable and practical route into Jaguar ownership for so many young people. And kind of ironic in a way that Jaguar released that car 20 years ago to appeal to a younger audience, and that legacy has continued into classic cars as well.
Yes, it has. It is interesting. The more shows you go to as the years go by, the X-Type presence becomes stronger and stronger. And I think that is reverence to that particular model. It was a cracking piece of kit. When the diesel came along in 2003, 2004, round about that period, it gave us another huge opportunity. But clearly, when you take on the BMW, the mighty BMW 3 Series, the A4 or the Mercedes C-Class, you are entering a different type of world. So it's not whether its underpinnings are A or B, it's whether or not you can compete in that market, and that has always proven difficult for us, always proven difficult.
Peter, you're very clearly proud of being a Jaguar employee of the past.
Very
what
much
was
so.
the biggest highlight for you of your time there?
It's always very difficult. I've got to be very careful because there was a highlight with XK8. I'm not sure whether I should really go into that. No, I don't think I will, just in case. But as part of working for Jaguar, I had the privilege of working abroad for them. And working abroad for a company like Jaguar, the reverence that people showed to the brand was almost godlike. It was almost worrying. You know, it was a strange feeling, but everybody just loved them. And you'd go to places where they'd have an old Mark I XJ that literally was falling to bits, but they loved the car. There was this love of the brand, and it's something you don't find around anywhere else, I don't think, other than the really elite brands. So Jaguar has got that something about it which never leaves you. And you look around the scene here, I'm talking to the converted anyway. It's in our DNA, it's part of us. But I think one of the things that amused me most, and it was something I was very proud of at Jaguar, was during the Egan period, we had what was known as Hearts and Minds, where we were all encouraged to work together as units inside and outside the factory. And I was dragged into the HR director's office because I was part of training, and he said, you used to play rugby? I said, well, I still do. He said, well, the apprentice rugby team needs a new leader. I said, you're it. I said, right, okay, fine. We lost our first game 53-0. But the only celebrations were in the Jaguar dressing room. There was singing and screaming. And the people we played against were Dunlop. And they were all morose, and they just won 53-0. And they said, what is it about you guys at Jaguar? You've just lost by a cricket score, and you're happy and you're over the moon. And I said, I don't know what it is, but whatever we do, we smile and laugh. He said, well, can you share it with us, because we need it. But it was an extraordinary feeling. And we used to run things like games against the staff. And I remember on one of them, we were a player short of a fly half, and the sales and marketing director at the time, Neil Johnson, got to hear that we were short, gave me a call and said, Peter, I hear you're short, can I play? And that was what Jaguar was about, everybody working together and playing together. It was magic. Just a wonderful feeling.
And here we are enjoying Jaguars all together at last after some very weird times that we've all suffered. And fantastic to have you in person on a stage instead of through Zoom and stuff like that we've got fed up of over the last few years. If you want to hear more from Peter Leake, by the way, you can hear a full interview with Peter on the Jaguar Enthusiast Club podcast at jecpodcast.co.uk. But for now, Peter Leake, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed, Wayne. Thank you very much. Cheers.